Oh, there we go. Recording is going. And if I could just figure out how to, there we go, share my screen. Not allowing me to share my screen. Sorry, everyone, we're having a little technical error. It's only giving me the option to leave the meeting, which I don't want to do. Let's try again and see if it'll allow me to share.
Do you have the share screen slash, you have that button at the bottom?
No.
Should be green.
Okay. All right, here we go. All right, can everyone see that?
Yes.
Awesome. Okay, sorry about that. So welcome everyone. Thank you for spending your lunch with me. We know that everyone's lunch is pressed for time, so we'll make this quick. So today's Lunch and Learn is about how to keep your spine healthy. And so for those that I have not met, my name is Dr. Lizette Sunday. My LLC is actually Compete Physical Therapy and Wellness, but I am located at EHP. So if I have not met you, come on in and say hi. So what we're going to do today is, without getting too technical or sciencey, is we're just going to have a brief introduction on just mobility first. And this is super important. So it's actually even more important than the spine part of it, because what we talk about for the mobility portion, we can address also in the spine. Okay. All right, so this is me. Hi. So this is just what we're going to talk about today, just briefly. First, again, general mobility, and then how you should approach treating your mobility problem. So again, this can be applied to many areas of the body, just not the spine. So it's actually great education. But then we'll get more specifically into the thoracic spine, and then some specific exercises. So just a quick background about me. I've been a physical therapist for 12 years. I'm a board certified orthopedic specialist. So I see lots of different ortho things. And I'm certified in the selective functional movement assessment, which is basically a movement screen. And I thought this would be a great discussion because the spinal mobility problem is one that I see often, almost daily in my practice. All right, this is just a cover your ass slide. Not specific to you, but if you're wondering how you move, I would love to see you for a screen. Okay, so mobility 101. So mobility should include, we have passive techniques, and those are what most people are familiar with. Those are things like foam rolling and static stretches and lacrosse balls and all those wonderful things that people do to kind of maintain their motion. But it kind of goes beyond that. So after our passive techniques, what we want to do is what we call an active technique. And we're basically, just like it sounds, active is we're using the muscle to actively go through your full or improved range of motion after your passive techniques. So it reinforces the motion through its new motion. but it's actively being completed from the muscle. Then there's a third, and that's a loaded technique. Loaded techniques help the motion by using a force, an outside force like a weight to gain new motion. And we'll talk about that a little later, but this makes the muscle even work harder. And this actually creates more long-term changes in mobility. So why mobility in general is needed? The ability to get into proper position. And this is incredibly important. So, I'm seeing some CrossFitters at EHP, right? And so if you don't have proper mobility to get into some of those positions that you need to in end range, what the body is really, really good at is compensating. And so without you even knowing it, if you have a mobility problem, let's say in the ankles, then your body will create a compensation, let's say a bigger knee bend, to compensate for that ankle that doesn't move. So it's really important to help you get into proper position. It's important for you to execute the sport or the lift or the motion, and you can do that more efficiently if you have more range of motion. Obviously, the more efficient the motion or the move that you're doing, the more you can maximize your performance. And then, of course, we want to, above all anything else, we want to avoid injury and compensation. Okay, so 4 steps to improving mobility. And I want you to think about these steps as kind of like a chain, like we talked about. So these are not separate entities like, oh, I'm just going to do this first, and then maybe I'll do this another time. These really should go in order. Okay. So screens, I've always been a huge believer in screening, not just because I'm certified in it, but I've worked in a clinic seeing outpatient orthopedics for 12 years before I decided to open my own practice. And in the clinic where I have seen people before, I actually have very little time to screen people. But I will still do a partial screen even with that little time, because it is the most important thing that you can do in order to assess if you actually have a mobility problem. So it's hard to know if you actually have a mobility deficit without actually screening and looking at individual movements and individual muscles. Passive is going to come right after that screen. So after you've had that screen and you determine you have a mobility problem, you're going to do some passive techniques, right? And this is those foam rolling and lacrosse ball things. Any soft tissue, and it includes any soft tissue or joint stimulus from that outside source, like the foam roller or the lacrosse balls or the massage therapist or the chiropractor. They're all very passive. It's an outside stimulus. Next to follow that is the active. And so this involves, like we talked about previously, this involves firing or contracting the muscle into its new range after the passive range of motion has been done. Okay. Essentially, what's happening when you do that is you're teaching your nervous system to be comfortable with contracting in the new range. Okay. And the last one is loading. And loading is really where the mobility magic happens. This step really is kind of the bridge. It bridges the gap between having just available range of motion and really being able to use it. Okay. So we'll talk about those in detail a little bit later too. Okay. So some examples with the passive techniques here. Some pictures on the right. And so a lot of us are comfortable with doing this. We've talked about them. You've probably done them, on your own. You've done them in yoga. A few years ago, physical therapy and just lots of those type of disciplines thought, you know, the foam rolling was like the end all be all to your mobility problems. Like, oh, just foam roll. Before that, it was even just static stretches where you're just sitting and holding a stretch. But we know that, you know, after lots of studies, it's actually just a temporary change in mobility, and it can be as little as hours, sometimes just days. So although they feel good and they are important, it really is just a temporary change in the mobility. So no, you can't really foam roll out scar tissue. We know that's just impossible. And there's so many attachments to that scar tissue and the muscle. There's fibrosis and tendons and things like that. It really just doesn't make sense. It's not going to create a permanent change. Okay. So in the clinic, other examples would be like dry needling or acupuncture, something that Dr. Solom does, dry needling, which is what I do, instrument assisted soft tissue. So, you know, that little instrument there rubbing the foot, all good, can cause immediately changes, but it's really only temporary. Okay. So the question then becomes like, well, if it's temporary, then why should I use it, right? Why should I spend time working on it? How do I go back here? We skipped a few. Here we go. Okay. So yeah, so if it's temporary, why should I take time to work on it, Dr. Sunday? So the reason we feel so great after soft tissue mobilization is because it creates a reduction in neurotone to an area. And so muscle does not work independently of itself. Nerves go hand in hand with muscle and how they feel and how they work. So if you thought you were just stretching muscle by laying on a foam roller, sorry, sorry, that's wrong. Muscles and joints are interconnected by our nervous system. So that's where that kind of feel good pain relief comes into play. But like we talked about, it does create a temporary change, but it's important because one, it can reduce pain. One, it can immediately get you into different end ranges. But the most important part, it is because it is the foundation for active mobility. So getting the muscle and joint to move through its full range before you load it is very important. Okay, so temporary relaxation of the nervous system, plus whatever we need to get those joints moving, like mobilization or manipulation, kind of like a chiropractic pop or me working on a joint, will provide you with temporary pain relief and mobility changes. And that's why it's important. Okay, so the reason people fail to make gains though after using those temporary things is because people do fail to work actively after those passive gains. And so people just kind of stop with their recovery by doing those quick things like foam rolling, but then forget to kind of use those muscles through that. Okay, so the lunch and learn part of this, how do I maintain a mobile and healthy spine? I better talk about that, right? Since that's why we're here. All right, so to make this as non-sciencey and non-technical as possible, we're actually going to talk very specifically about the thoracic spine. And so that's that middle part there, not the cervical, which is the neck, not the lumbar, which is the low back. It's just the middle part of the spine. So obviously, these parts of the spine are not separated during an activity, for example, like the squat. But just because this is a short lunch and learn, and again, not to make it too sciencey, we're just going to talk about this middle part, okay? And a second reason that we want to talk about this is because this is commonly the most mobility problem I see behind the ankle. I would say this and the ankle is probably one of the most common mobility issues I see. You can see that the thoracic spine is connected to the ribs, so it does complicate it more. But this part of the spine specifically is meant to extend or straighten and rotate, and that's because those ribs are attached to it. Okay, so this position is an example of just the extension. Okay, it's important, especially in all squat variations. Its job specifically is extension, and like we talked about with the ribs, rotation. This right here, like this move that she's doing, is often a position of testing. And so if I ever see this in the clinic or with one of my athletes, this is one where we should have a very nice uniform curve from the thoracic spine to the low back without hinging at the low back and without the hips lifting off of the bed. Okay, so for people who can't do that, that's often an indicator to me that maybe they don't have that thoracic extension mobility. Okay. This motion is just really important. Even if you had perfect mobility of your shoulders in a squat position, for example, but your mid spine can't extend, it will limit your overhead squat. That's how important this is. No matter how good the shoulder mobility is, and no matter how strong the shoulders are. Okay, so here's a few passive techniques. Everyone knows these. Well, most maybe everyone. So on the right, there is a roll side to side, so butt is up. On the second one, it's basically a hinge. So, or on the first one, excuse me. So the hinge, I'm keeping my butt down. The reason that my knees are so close to my chest is so that motion doesn't come from the low back. So if I'm really stiff in my mid back and I don't bring those knees up, I'm actually going to do a whole lot of arching from the low back. Okay. All right. Okay, here's a few active techniques. So after those passive, whether you're doing a lacrosse ball, a foam roll, you'll notice that I'm working into the motion. See if we can play that again. That was really quick. So there's the rotation. Okay, rotation upward. Part of those ribs need to rotate. And this is kind of a rotation downward. And what I'm doing in each position is I'm making sure not to side lean. So I'm not bending my spine. I'm simply rolling, kind of like on a pole or an axis. Okay, so just a few examples there to do after your passive techniques. Okay, here's another active technique. This is called an open book. So what my left hand is doing is it's holding down my hips essentially, because as I roll back, I don't want that lumbar part to rotate. So I only want to rotate my upper back. There we go. And so this is more extension as well as rotation, but you want to make sure that nothing else is moving. So again, with these active motions, you want to move the joint and the muscle that controls that particular motion throughout its full range of motion. But you can't do that without doing the passive technique first and trying to get as much motion as possible. Okay, so another example of an active technique here, but I'm involving the shoulder. Okay, so you'll see my left hand is basically on the ground. My right hand is on a weight. And so this allows me to overload my right shoulder a little bit more. So this is also a position that's great for shoulder stability. So if I had a person who was very weak in the shoulder, but also had a thoracic problem, especially going into extension, this is a very good exercise to do that. So offsetting the hands, I'm pressing through and trying to push through that shoulder. And there you could see at the very end that my spine is really going into extension. Okay, we'll watch it one more time. This is not a rotation thing, but if someone was having trouble with like an overhead overhead squat, okay, and trying to maintain that extension, this is a good position for that, or a good exercise for that. Okay. All right, so loading it. So this is kind of that third phase of where, or I'm sorry, last phase, fourth phase of where we load. And so when we load, for the purpose of mobility, let's make that very clear. This is not strengthening. If we have a mobility problem, we want to load it, but we want to think about eccentrics. And so basically eccentrics are the slowing down part of an exercise. So for example, if you were in a squat position, that's your hips going down towards the floor, but in a very, but an eccentric is the slowing down part. So your hips slowly going towards the floor. Okay, it's basically the negative part of the exercise. Eccentrics have been repeatedly shown in research studies to create more tissue level changing in flexibility. So more than passive, more than massage. So if you can eccentrically control an exercise, basically what the muscle does is it shortens. So it has to create flexibility changes. So we're changing the structure of a muscle to be able to move more through its range of motion. Okay, so instead of those temporary neurological changes like we just see in the passive part, we're trying to use the muscle and now load it. So I should have slowed down here a little bit more, but just for the purpose of the video and fitting it into my presentation. So this is kind of what we were doing on the active part of it, right? But now I'm doing it against a band. So working into that rotation and extension, but I have a force that I'm doing it against. I'll show you that one more time. Okay, so another load, same concept. So if you're looking at the middle of my spine here, what I'm doing is I'm extending and also rotating. So if I were to give this to an athlete, I really don't want my hips to move a whole lot, okay, like mine are. It's a little bit too hard of a band for me in this position. It's all I had on vacation, so this is what I got to work with. Does the pool make everyone just feel just terrible also, by the way? One more time, but extension and rotation, and we call that a lift. I could take that resistance from a upward position and also go down, and we call that a chop. So same idea, loading it into a rotation. Okay, so we don't think of a whole lot of spinal mobility here, right? This is similar to just a goblet squat, okay? But what we're doing is we are eccentrically doing an isometric for this technique to gain more motion. And so even though it doesn't seem like my spine is moving a whole lot here, what I'm trying to do is maintain the extension of my middle back as I go low. And so when you're doing those eccentric isometrics to gain mobility, what we're doing is doing a slow eccentric portion of the exercise, which is the negative, okay? And we're following it with a pause. So you'll see me pause at the bottom. We call that an isometric contraction. And the cue I'm giving to myself or to my athletes is chest up, so that I could gain more of that extension, not from my low back, but from my mid back. Okay. Then there's supposed to be an explosive motion upward. Okay. That's what we call the concentric part of that exercise. Typically, the negative or the slowing down should be about a 5 to 7 second hold. Okay. Used with a 3 to 5 second pause at the bottom, followed by the explosion or concentric motion. So the slow negative gets the athlete to focus on the movement. Okay. So whatever cues I'm giving to the athlete, chest up, whatever mobility exercise it might be, what you're trying to do is focus on the movement that you're trying to work more into, and trying to control it themselves. Many movement faults can be corrected when the athlete decreases his or her speed and really just hones in on the proper technique or position. And because of the slow tempo, so if this is something that you wanted to try, even for an ankle or even for a knee or anything it might be, because of the slow tempo, we only typically do about 2 to 4 reps. Okay, 2 to 4 reps, you can do about 3 rounds. And the loading could still be heavy. And that's also the other reason for the low reps. So the loading could be, anywhere between 50 to 90% of your 1 rep max. But it's the eccentric part that's really great for those flexibility changes. Okay. That's it. So I love feedback, good or bad. I'll take it. Good is great. Bad is how you learn and do different things. So, and I also really love talking to people about their pain and problem solving, why people might have pain, especially when other practitioners can't figure it out. So if you have any questions, even just about yourself or about what we talked about today, I would love to hear from you. Here is, all right, here's my info. I have an Instagram page. I have no idea what my name is on there. I'm sorry. I'm not very good on social media. But I would really love any follows on Facebook. There's my website and contact information. You can text me at that number, or you can email me, but yes, you can text at the number, that is okay, or give me a call.
Hey, Doc, I think you alluded to this a little bit, but, you talked about like a lot of times people will come and see us and they get the passive stuff done that we help them do, and they're more comfortable doing the passive things. What would be like your biggest, like you said, you typically see where they don't make the long changes because they don't implement the active, right? I see the same thing. Yeah. So what would be like your biggest like take home, punch home message to like get people's mind wrapped around like passive, like, and then rolling right into that active part?
Yeah.
I would even think some people are more likely to load that I work with than that active part.
Yes, absolutely. And so this is kind of one of the, I think part of it is it's a multifactorial problem. So 1, people just want to get in and out and better really quick. 2, I typically try to tell people like, this will take some time, please come back. But, then they have to take time out of their day to come back, or they have to pay for visits or things like that. But I typically try to make that warning, like this will not come easy, or we're going to have to work through this and it could take some time. But yes, and it might be all those things that, or people sometimes feel better because, right, those passive techniques make those temporary changes. And so people are like, okay, well, I'm done. I feel better. Thank you so much. And then they don't get the exercise to load it. And that pain often comes back later. So very common. And I see it all the time. And I'll see those people months later and I'm like, oh, you didn't come back to therapy. I'm so sorry. So what I try to implement during my practice is making that temporary change really quick and then giving them the active exercise right away so that they can implement that force into that newfound motion very quickly. I will say, I want you to come back. I want you to do this exercise, or if I can even provide them an exercise that will progress it and load it. Over text or over my home exercise program app, I will do that any way I can. But yes, it's very common. And and so don't make that mistake if you're having mobility problems or you're in pain. So that's pretty big. And the second one, the second common question I get is, well, how long will this take? Mobility, unfortunately, takes the longer part of any any pain source. If it's a motor control problem, that could be fixed right away with some corrective exercises. Mobility, especially if it's been there for a long time, can just take some time. But working through all four stages, active, passive, loading, is I think scoots it along faster.
Yeah, I agree. And oftentimes if people are a little bit older, they tend to be stiffer and less mobile.
Yeah.
And I'm like, well, you didn't just arrive here from a week ago, and it's not going to get better in a week. It's going to take that time. And I think from standpoints of what we both do is the more people are willing to work on it on their own, the less they actually need to come and see us. And I think that sometimes is like maybe a light bulb goes on for some people there. Like, if you don't work on a lot of this on your own, I'll be seeing you more often.
Yeah.
So
yeah.
I think that's a motivator for some
calling
too.
me old.
What was that,
I hear
Lizzie?
you calling me old. Lizette, we haven't had a chance to meet yet, and my camera is all super weird like yours is, Carla. I don't know.
I know. Yeah.
Is it a Zoom setting? I don't know. Oh, wait a minute. I know what the issue with mine is. Okay, well, you haven't met me yet. I'm going to try to fix this camera while we're talking. But so Lindsay Olson, member of the gym. You can call me Lo. You can call me Lindsay. I won't answer to Mrs. Olson, so best of luck with that. I am a question asker, which Carla can tell you. Like, I love asking questions. How do you, like, talk a little bit more about knowing when you go from, like, when you should load? So I have been working a fair amount on mobility, specifically shoulder mobility. I do ROMWOD 3 days a week at home. I try to come to yoga. Now that my travel is done, I get to commit to 8 solid weeks, which is so exciting. So how do I know, like, when I'm ready to start loading that?
That's a really good question. So I'll answer that and say even load safely. And so there's different ways that you know how to load. When you feel like your mobility actively is a little bit better and more controlled. And so when you go into load, it doesn't immediately need to be in like a position where you're upright and holding a lot of weight, like the 50 to 90% of the 1 rep max that we talked about. Sometimes there can be corrective. And I'll make it a little bit more complicated and say it might even depends on other parts of the body. But when you feel like you can load it in a controlled fashion or grab a weight and control it, that's when you know how to load and also increase that load. Because you're using such a low amount of repetition for the mobility part of this, the loading part or the weight part of it is not as important as the control. Does that make sense, or does that answer your question?
Yeah, nope, I totally get it, because we've talked a lot about it in the last 6 months. It's really, for me, it's been trying to continue to focus on technique. It's the same concept. It's that it's
Right.
less is more in terms of don't put the weight on until you have the movement truly figured out and you're strong in that movement. So it's exactly the same thing. Yep.
Right. And that's awesome. So yeah, whereas like you want to load to get stronger, this is just loading to get the muscle to activate or to fire more. It's not necessarily a strength thing. And that's kind of why we
Yep.
don't follow those 2 to 4 reps of like 3 sets max. We're not necessarily following it in this place. The important part of loading is the control. Like, can you slowly and eccentrically control the weight that you have or the movement that you have with proper control, and basically that's when I would start loading it more. But the mechanics of it and the control of it are much more important.
Got it.
Did that answer your question, Lindsay?
Yep.
Yeah. And I'll just add to that. One of the second most common questions is, or the things that I see is, well, can I just work around this? And so this depends on a lot of different areas of the body. And like Carla said, like sometimes people will just go load. Like, oh, don't worry about the screen. I don't know if I have a mobility problem, but you cannot work through a mobility problem. So you can't physically stretch out an ankle that cannot move. There are, there's cartilage and there's labrums and there's capsules that can be very stiff. And so the hands-on part of this, like what I do and what Dr. Solon does, is very important. You can't just like, well, I'm just going to go load it and see if I get better. That doesn't work all the time. So that's why that passive part is really important.
Awesome. Well, thank you, Dr. Lizette. I'm just talking to this camera. For sharing with us today. We look forward to having you back again. If you wouldn't mind hitting the save to the cloud when you are done with the record, that would be awesome.
Okay.
Thanks, guys.
Thanks, everyone.